How could the playing of two clarinetists inspire famous composers to pursue new creative paths? What did it mean to grant the viola a solo identity? And can the impetus provided by one of the clarinetists somehow be linked to a composer's ruminations on mortality? Hello, I'm Jeffrey Kallberg, professor of music history and associate dean for arts and letters at the University of Pennsylvania. With these briefer than usual remarks, I hope to help frame your experience of the wonderful compositions by Brahms and Mozart on this concert, and to suggest some ways you might reflect on the music you're about to hear. Before I focus on my main topics, I need to note three oddities about the works on the program. First is the striking combination of instruments in the Mozart trio: clarinet, viola, and piano. This was not a normal chamber ensemble in 1786. The Mozart may be the first chamber piece ever with this scoring. An 18th century piano trio would normally have, in addition to the piano, one instrument in the soprano register, like the violin or flute, and one instrument in the bass register, like the cello. Both instruments in the Mozart fall into what we can loosely call the alto register, and this is highly unusual. The second curiosity has to do with the nickname for the Mozart trio, Kegelstatt, or Skittles Place. While we know Mozart enjoyed games like skittles and billiards, and we know that he noted on the manuscript for another piece that he wrote it while playing skittles, we do not know how this moniker got associated with this trio. Mozart's autographed manuscript just gives the city and the date it was completed. It's unlikely that the name signifies anything at all about Mozart's own understanding of the piece. The third unusual fact concerns the Brahms piece. In Brahms's time, it was not all that common for a composer to release a piece simultaneously in two different instrumental adaptations. In this case, sonatas for clarinet adapted as sonatas for viola. Although this move obviously broadened the market for the two pieces, Brahms's decision also has aesthetic repercussions, telling us both about the similarities in the expressive possibilities for the two instruments, and also about their differences. The two versions are by no means identical. With these observations in mind, I'd like to consider the three topics I mentioned at the start of this talk. Anton Stadler was born in 1753 in a small town near Vienna. By the time he was 20, he was already renowned as a clarinet and basset horn player. Apart from an extended concert tour throughout Europe after Mozart's death, Stadler spent the large majority of his career in and around Vienna. He seems to have led something of a dissolute life, dying in poverty in 1812. As far as we know, Mozart may have first encountered Stadler around 1781, right around the time he himself first moved to Vienna. By 1783 or so, it is clear that the two had become close musical collaborators and indeed close friends. We have some ideas of the qualities of Stadler's playing that attracted Mozart from comments about Stadler's performance of Mozart's Serenade K361. I have never heard the like of what you contrived with your instrument. Never should I have thought that a clarinet could be capable of imitating the human voice as it was imitated by you. Indeed, your instrument has so soft and lovely a tone that no one can resist it. Among the Mozart works that Stadler inspired were Tonight's Trio from 1786, the Clarinet Quintet from 1789, the Clarinet Concerto, 1791, and obligato parts, that is to say solo parts accompanying the singer, in two arias from Mozart's 1791 opera La Clemenza di Tito. The two arias are Parto, Parto, ma tu ben mio, and Non più di fiori. Notice that all of these pieces feature the clarinet in a solo role. This was rare. Audiences of the time would more commonly have encountered the instrument alongside many others in wind bands and ensembles. But listeners in the 1780s would not have expected to encounter the clarinet where we all do, namely in the symphony orchestra. It was really only in the next decade that the clarinet became a normal part of the woodwinds in an orchestra, thanks in part to the example of Mozart's 3 last symphonies and the last few of Haydn's London symphonies. Richard Mühlfeld. Roughly a century later than Stadler emerged the figure of Richard Mühlfeld. Born in 1856 in Thuringia in Germany, he developed his career in a spa orchestra and later was a key member of the Meiningen Court Orchestra, which Brahms worked with frequently and with whom he premiered his 4th Symphony. Brahms thought the Meiningen Orchestra was the ideal orchestra, and it was a somewhat smaller orchestra than the larger orchestras that were in Vienna. Like Stadler, Mühlfeld died relatively young in 1907, a decade after Brahms's passing. For us, the key fact about Mühlfeld is that in 1891, shortly after Brahms completed what he thought would be his final composition, the String Quintet in G major, opus 111, he was taken by friends to hear Mühlfeld play the first Weber Clarinet Concerto and the Mozart Clarinet Quintet. The experience was so moving that Brahms took up his musical pen again. Without this encounter, the world of music might never have known not only the 4 great pieces that featured the solo clarinet, the clarinet trio, the clarinet quintet, and the 2 sonatas on our program, they also would not have had a chance to experience Brahms's last 4 sets of piano pieces, opus 116, 17, 18, and 19, and the 4 serious songs, the 4 ernste Gesänge. Truly, Mühlfeld is an unsung hero of classical music. Brahms was attracted to special aspects of Mühlfeld's playing, proclaiming to his closest friend Clara Schumann that no one can blow the clarinet more beautifully than Herr Mühlfeld. As with Mozart and Stadler, Brahms quickly became close friends with Mühlfeld. The 2 dined together just 9 days before Brahms died. The viola is a marvelous instrument, but for much of the first 2 centuries that it was commonly used in ensembles, it was consigned to the accompaniment, filling in harmonies in the middle register. It seldom featured as a melodic instrument. When rarely it did, it usually doubled another melodic instrument. This remained true well into the first decades of the 19th century. And it is true, therefore, for most of the Mozart trio. Just as was the case with the cello parts in Mozart's more orthodox piano trios, with violin, cello, and piano, the viola in the Kegelstatt mostly plays accompaniment. Curiously, while we know that Stadler inspired the inclusion of the clarinet in this trio, we do not know why Mozart decided to use viola instead of the cello. The viola mostly plays accompaniment, but not always. It participates in the tossing about of the primary turn motive in the first movement, provides significant rhythmic drive in the minuet, and participates in some canonic play around the melody in the concluding rondeau. So Mozart may have used the occasion of this unusual scoring to begin to elevate the status of the viola in ensembles. We can also infer that Mozart thought highly of the viola from the important solo role he gave it in his Sinfonia Concertante K364, and by the nature of the scoring he adopted for his string quintets, 2 violins, 2 violas, and cello, rather than what we encounter, say, in the Schubert string quintet, 2 violins, 1 viola, and 2 low-string instruments. Indeed, Mozart's quintets are often referred to as the viola quintets. And it's also not a coincidence that Brahms's string quintets also use Mozart's viola-inflected instrumentation. One of the most important genres for the development of a more active role for the viola was the string quartet, especially Beethoven's, and particularly and movingly so in his late quartets. A natural consequence of equalizing the instruments in the quartet, often by focusing on contrapuntal and/or fugal writing, is that the viola emerges into the foreground of our consciousness in these pieces. Berlioz, in his treatise on orchestration, made a plea for more frequent expressive attention to be paid to the viola, noting its quality of profound melancholy. Berlioz's earlier experience in composing his splendid Harold in Italy, a large work for solo viola and orchestra, may have had something to do with this characterization. Still, solo sonatas for viola remained something of a rarity through the 19th century, and the Brahms pieces can be seen as the culmination of a long process that granted an independent voice to this instrument. It's striking, though, that even here, that voice is as an adaptation of a clarinet piece. I mean, he did not publish them first as viola sonatas, first and foremost as viola sonatas. So the viola is still somewhat in the background. But this model established by Brahms really paid its benefits in the 20th century, where solo viola sonatas became more common. And in this vein, I'd like to draw particular attention to Shostakovich's remarkable viola sonata, the last work he composed shortly before he died in 1975. If you read anything about the Brahms sonatas, you will soon encounter sentiments like these from Jerry Dubin's review of the recording by clarinetist Laura Ruiz Ferreras that we will hear shortly. Undoubtedly, it was Mühlfeld who brought Brahms out of retirement, but I suspect that if Mühlfeld's instrument had been anything other than the clarinet, his entreaties to Brahms would have been met with stubborn resistance. There was something about the timbre of the clarinet, a reedy, rich mix of autumn colors, and the feelings of loneliness and longing evoked by fallen leaves and the stirrings of approaching winter, that resonated with Brahms's fatalistic mood. All 4 of the works he composed for the instrument reflect a sense of wistful melancholy and of turning inward. Autumn colors, loneliness, longing evoked by fallen leaves, stirrings of approaching winter, Brahms's fatalistic mood, wistful melancholy, and turning inward. Surely we have no trouble assimilating descriptions like these to this music, even as we understand that Brahms may have been keen to allow these expressive conditions also to emerge from the alternative, if related, tone color of the viola. Remember Berlioz's description of the profound melancholy evoked by the sound of the viola. What we hear expressed in these and other similar characterizations of the works Brahms wrote toward the end of his life is the notion of a late style. Late style is a long-established concept and one applied widely across the arts. Consider the works that Beethoven, Rembrandt, Monet, Shakespeare, and Henry James produced in their last years. In these vastly different kinds of artistic expressions, we sense certain common threads: an accumulated wisdom, a mastery of craft, and a profundity of expression mixed with some element of resignation and fulfillment. By way of some contrast, the literary critic Edward Said has drawn attention to those aspects of late style that emphasize qualities of opposition, intransigence, and unresolved contradiction. Often these characteristics seem to emerge naturally from the contemplation of mortality. And this last idea explains why late style can be meaningful even for artists who died young. Schubert, think of his last 3 piano sonatas, and Chopin, think of the Barcarolle, the Polonaise Fantasy, provide good examples from classical music. In the instance of Brahms, the case for late style seems almost overdetermined biographically. He himself had spoken of retiring from composition after completing the string quintet. While he wrote his last works, many of his closest friends died. He tackled the subject of death directly in one of his 4 serious songs, O Tod, wie bitter bist du, O Death, how bitter you are, all while, as was his lifelong custom, living as a bachelor, the apparent epitome of loneliness and melancholy. It is this biographical context that gives extra force to the presence and sound of the clarinet and to the sound of its alto cousin, the viola. Brahms, a diligent student of music history, would have been well aware of the concentration of compositions for the clarinet toward the end of Mozart's life, though he wouldn't have been inclined to include the Kegelstatt trio as late Mozart. He often used such historical models as points of departure for his own compositional forays, and it would not be surprising if that were the case here. More importantly, we should recall the account of Anton Stadler's clarinet playing that I quoted earlier in this talk, which expressed astonishment at the degree to which his playing mimicked the human voice. Richard Mühlfeld surely aroused the same sentiments in Brahms a century later, and this near approach to the human must account for some of the particular poignancy we hear in the late Brahms sonatas. An instrument can mimic a singing human voice, but it can never be a human voice. If the lyrical line of the clarinet yearningly but asymptotically approaches the human voice, the impossibility of reaching that goal must nurture at the very least a kind of wistfulness, and at the very worst, something akin to desolation. And yet, how much of this kind of late style hearing represents a conditioned response on the part of listeners? Large swaths of the Brahms clarinet sonatas would seem to have nothing to do with tropes of profundity and wistfulness that seem to lie at the center of our fixation on the late style. While the aching beauty of the second theme of the F minor sonata might evoke nostalgia and mortality, the storminess of the beginning of the movement hardly seems cut from this melancholic cloth. And though I've tried to make the case for a kind of timbral consanguinity between the clarinet and the viola, they're not quite the same. Do we really hear as many intimations of mortality in the viola version as we do in the clarinet? Though we might hear the surprisingly gentle nature of the Allegro amabile opening of the E-flat major sonata as setting the listener up for the experience of nostalgic lightness, we might equally hear it as a purely musical response to the unusual opening andante movement of the Kegelstatt trio. And intimations of mortality were certainly not pressing on Mozart at the height of his powers in 1786. What's to say the Brahms didn't conceive of these last compositions as purely life-affirming rather than inward and fatalistic? So it's complicated, this matter of late style, and ultimately a question for each of us to reckon on our own. Musical profundity can be measured in many ways, but one of them is the ability to encourage multiple interpretations and on multiple levels, reaching all the way to no interpretations at all. It's in the nature of these pre-concert talks to suggest ways that audiences can make deeper sense of the music that they hear. But there's nothing at all wrong, especially so in these troubled times, with just letting the music soothe, excite, or console you. Whether you're inclined to mull over what Brahms and Mozart might have meant, or whether you want to let the music transport you away from daily cares, you've chosen a wonderful program. Thank you for your attention, and I hope you enjoy the concert.